I'm Jenny Moon. I work in CEMP and have been here for about 7 years, I should think. My research field is pedagogy, teaching and learning. I do now have a media background in the sense that I've fairly recently done an MA in creative writing, but mainly my work in CEMP has been on the background teaching and learning ideas. I think when I came to CEMP I was working on reflective learning, and that remains a major area of the work I do in workshops and kind of work with staff and students. I then moved on to looking at critical thinking. I was interested in what this thing was, this word that is used so widely in higher education, and how come it is used in so many different ways when most students assume there is one thing that is critical thinking. So I wrote a book about that. In fact, that's the way my research works, is that I tend to write a book about the topics I'm interested in and explore them at length in a book length. I moved on from critical thinking to look at what I called academic assertiveness. It came out of the work on critical thinking. Because I feel that to be a critical thinker, people need to be willing to express their opinions and stand up for themselves, and to make comments like, I've made a mistake, or I don't know the answer to that. Academic assertiveness became a chapter in the book on critical thinking, and then it became 2 chapters, and then it became a book in itself. And I think there's a lot of way for that to go yet. My last book, my most recent interest, has been on story, because I have always been interested in the role story plays in education and what we mean by story. And I felt that the literature again was all over the place. We use the word story in all sorts of different ways, and I was anxious to see if there was any underpinning to it that could be pulled together. And it took me 100 pages in the book to even get anywhere near that, and I think I just scratched the surface. But then the rest of the book is about the uses of story in higher education and professional development. I've got kind of principles that have led me to look in these areas, and those are actually a serious criticism of an awful lot of what has been written already, and the models people use, and the simplistic ways in which people talk about incredibly complex functions such as learning and indeed teaching. I've come to many of these topics one by one and have chosen to write on them. And I've chosen to write because they were terms that were contentious. I felt that there was a lot of work to do on reflective learning. It was becoming an idea talked about in the early 1990s and progressed and has been adopted very widely, and I still felt that a lot of the models were fairly nonsensical, and I wanted to explore them much more deeply. And for example, with reference to reflective learning, I felt that we didn't, most of the previous literature hadn't linked the process of learning into reflection. You know, they obviously have to relate, and not many people had really made much attempt to look at how they relate. So I used my writings in one book and then another to actually explore some of those sort of ideas. So I suppose that second principle is of trying to get to the bottom of what goes on when students sit down and learn. And then what is it that a teacher, I mean by teacher anyone who's actually in the process of teaching, needs to do to support that learning. So I've always at the end of the books spent a lot of time thinking about, so what in the classroom, what difference does that make? One of the forms of exercise that I developed back in early 2000s, which I call a graduated scenario, which I use to help students to learn what reflective learning looks like, reflective writing looks like, and what I mean by depth in that area. And then subsequently I use the same form of exercise for critical thinking, so learning what critical thinking might look like and what we might mean by depth in critical thinking. I think that that's probably been quite central to a lot of the work I've done. But equally I've just been to a conference on story, and I know that because I spent a long time trying to work out what a story is, that work is being used quite widely now.